Okay, now I am going to introduce the person of the hour right now, Mr. Jeffrey Urban. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and add that spotlight. Jeff, thank you so much for being here today. As y'all may remember, Jeffrey has been with us a couple of times to speak for Exploring Tours, including one that I thought was incredible, which was Hobos in Hooverville, which just knocked my socks off, knocked my mom's socks off. She keeps talking to me about it still to this day. So thank you for that, Jeffrey, because like seriously, it's given us a lot to chat about. And I mean, not that I don't want to talk to my mom. She's very interesting, and we chat about all sorts of things. I can see Helen laughing at me right now. So anyway, but anyway, we've got Jeffrey here with us. He's the education specialist and from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Jeff, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards. Is that good?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, without further ado, everyone, Mr. Jeffrey Urban.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Lisa. I'm a little bit miffed that I hear so many great things going on, and I'm 1,500 miles away. I can't take advantage of them, so it makes me a little bit jealous. But those of you in the area, please make sure that you avail yourself to the opportunity. So thank you for having me back, and happy Veterans Day. And those of you that are veterans that are watching, as Dan said earlier, thank you so much for for your service, for your contribution, and for your sacrifice. We couldn't do what we do every day without the safety and support of our military and their families. So I want to thank all of you for that. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Franklin Roosevelt and World War II. And what I'd like to do is sort of present this material in kind of three sort of steps or three phases. The first is to put World War II in perspective, because I find that a lot of people, everybody knows about World War II, but a lot of people, don't really understand what it was all about. So we'll talk a teeny bit about that. Then we'll talk about why Franklin Roosevelt was the right man at the right time, in the right place to lead this country and, in fact, the world, the Allied forces through the Second World War. And then we'll talk a little bit about FDR's war goals and how it was that he, brought us through this tremendous time in not just American history, but world history as well. So, as I said a minute ago, a lot of people, everybody knows about World War II, but World War II gets, I think, shortchanged sometimes. Right after the Second World War ended, the Cold War began. And the Cold War was, kind of this sort of sexy thing of, the spies versus the spies, the United States versus the Soviet Union, weapons and all that sort of stuff. And, it was one of those things that sort of overshadowed the impact that World War II had. So let's put that in some perspective. First of all, World War II was huge. All right. It was absolutely huge. It was the absolute largest military conflict on this planet ever. Okay, and that can't be understated. It was a world war for sure. It involved most of the countries on the planet at the time, either as direct combatants or as suppliers to the war. It was a global war. It was fought on at least 5 continents, and you could argue that the sun never set on World War II. Once it began, it was being fought all around the world, and each and every day. So it went on day and night. It was always being fought somewhere, and it was also a total war. It was a war that involved not just the men and women on the front lines, but all men, women, and children in this country, certainly, and in much of the rest of the world. It involved military folks. It involved civilian folks. It involved the very young. It involved the very old. So it really was a total war. And it lasted for 6 years, and that would be 2,194 days. Started on September 1st, 1939, when when Germany invaded Poland. And it ended on September 2nd, 1945, when the Japanese surrendered in Tokyo Bay on the deck of the the USS Missouri, in a ceremony that lasted only 18 minutes. So the war lasted for 6 years, and it only took 18 minutes to sign the documents, seal them up, and be done with the war officially. So most people think, oh, the war started, on December 7th, 1941. That's when it started for us. It's not when it started for the rest of the world. 60 million people were killed in that 6-year war. That's 10 million people a year, right? I mean, everybody can do that math, but imagine that, 10 million people every year. Multiply that 60 million by their families, and you get an even more dramatic and a bigger sense of the human cost of the war. 16 million Americans served, 416,000 were killed. That would be 69,333 per year, 5,777 per month, 189 per day, and 8 per hour, if you break it down on average. So by the time we finish this program today, 8 American soldiers would have been killed in the Second World War. The cost of the war was $4 billion. That would be 35.8% of the gross domestic product, and $2 billion of that alone was spent on the development of the atomic bomb. Now we're talking billion with a B, and we're talking billion with a B, $1940. Okay, so we're talking big time money. And the impacts and the aftermath are still being felt today. The Cold War was a result of, World War II, the collapse of the wartime alliance. And, this was a huge, huge thing. It was so big, in fact, that we at the Roosevelt Library actually created a periodic table of World War II just to get people to understand, what a big conflict this was. You've got the good guys over here, you got the bad guys over here, you've got some of the major battles, some of the major events, and it is a huge, huge undertaking to try to describe what this war was to folks. And when the kids learn about it today in school, they get maybe 10 minutes on World War II, and then right on to the Cold War. This was a war that was fought with a huge undertone of racial and ethnic prejudice, right? Along with a lust for power, a lust for resources, greed, and just world domination. So there was a lot interplaying here. The Nazis were out to destroy anyone who did not fit their view of what the perfect Aryan was, the master race. And I always find it ironic that, if you look at the top layer or so of Nazis, people like, Hitler, of course, Goebbels, Speer, those kinds of folks. None of those guys would have fit the blonde-haired, blue-eyed version of what the Nazis were trying to, promote as, the Aryan race. So they were disqualified even from their own movement from that standpoint. And of course, the greatest hatred and belligerence and brutality was directed at the European Jews. And of course, that is the Holocaust. The war was fought with no guarantee that we would win. When the United States entered the war, we ranked anywhere from 14th to 17th in military power. We also entered the war with a significant portion of our Pacific Fleet destroyed, thanks to the Japanese on Pearl Harbor Day. We entered the war with largely World War I uniforms and weapons and equipment and training. After the First World War, the United States embarked on this peace movement, and we demilitarized. We took apart much of our army. Our numbers in uniform shrank down. We didn't build any new ships. We didn't, not many anyway. We didn't build many new planes. We really let our guard down because we didn't want to be drawn back into another war, especially like the First World War. After entering the war, we racked up significant losses all throughout 1942 and 1943. So even after the Japanese dragged us into the war, it took us almost 2 years to turn the tide and begin to make some progress. And in August of 1942, the Nazis had control of all of Europe, either through absolute domination and being there and occupying these countries, or they had surrounded the other countries, places like Spain and Portugal, Sweden, to the point where they had control of them because they couldn't do anything. They were so tightly surrounded. The Italians were all across North Africa and had taken across the entire top edge of Africa, and the Japanese had control or dominance in the Pacific Rim. That was August 1942. And so we really got into this war way behind. We were unprepared. We didn't have the equipment we needed, and we had a lot of catching up to do. Now, we benefited from several of Hitler's mistakes. One was that Hitler opened a second front against the Soviet Union, which took some of the heat off of us, and it forced him to now fight in two different directions, and in effect put himself into a vice as the Soviets were pushing in from one side and the Allies were pushing in from the other. Hitler went south and then turned right and west into North Africa. Had he gone south and turned left and east into the Middle East, he would have captured the oil-producing countries of that region, and he would have had an unlimited supply of resources to fuel his war and hate machine. And he depended a little bit too much on the Italians, who were in the northern part of Africa, and they were not as zealous about a lot of this stuff as, let's say, the Nazis were. And so the Italians soon became a liability, sort of an ally you couldn't really count on or trust, to fight as vigorously and as zealously as the Nazis were doing. So the Nazis had to kind of pick up some of the slack for that. So World War II, to say the least, not a pillow fight. It was an absolute most deadliest, most destructive, most costly war in the history of humankind. And probably the greatest lesson that we learned from World War II was that the world would not be able to survive a World War III. There were 11 million people killed in the First World War, right, and whose end we honor today on November 11th. There were about 60 million people killed during the Second World War, and there would be hundreds of millions of people killed in the Third World War if we were ever to have one. Roosevelt understood this. Roosevelt knew this. He understood, he'd given the order to go ahead and try to create an atomic bomb for the Allies because he knew that the Nazis were working on one. And so he knew that if that bomb worked, the next World War would probably use these things and hundreds of millions of people would be destroyed. So there we have the context for the leadership that Roosevelt provided. And, I hope I didn't bring everybody down by, going through all those grisly statistics and things. But certainly what I wanted to do was to give you an idea of what the war was all about. I mean, here's a picture of some of the destruction. This is material that was picked up after the D-Day invasion. So you can see, tanks and trucks and jeeps and all sorts of machine just destroyed. Here is a member of the American military, and he's eating at a field kitchen, and here he is having his lunch, right? So some of you just maybe having had lunch, and I bet it was nicer than standing on an old door eating K rations or C rations out of a can that was probably heated over an open fire. But this is what these guys did. Here is a soldier being brought to safety, again on D-Day, carried, I'm sure, by his buddies. And here is a photograph of jeeps that are being dried out because they got wet on the crossing over on D-Day. So when you think about this number, 16 million men, and the enormous amount of material that was used in this war, you just shake your head as to why did this have to happen? What a waste of human life, what a waste of material, and what a waste of time. But Franklin Roosevelt, I would argue, you could disagree, but I think you'd be wrong, is the exactly the right guy you wanted in that office at that time. And I'll build an argument for you right now. And again, you can disagree with that if you like. Roosevelt was the right man at the right place at the right time. Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt came to power within 6 weeks of each other. So Hitler comes to power in January of 1933. Roosevelt takes over the presidency in March of 1933. And then they each serve for 12 years. And they die within 3 weeks of each other. So Adolf Hitler, Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12th, and Adolf Hitler died on April 30th. So you had good and evil on the world stage at almost precisely the same time. Just as you had Hitler come to power, 6 weeks later, you had Franklin Roosevelt come to power, and he countered that evil for the next 12 years, and they died within 3 weeks of each other. FDR had Hitler's number early on. FDR had grown up traveling to Europe. He was a wealthy guy, and his parents would spend the summers over in Europe. And so he knew how to speak German, and he knew how to read German. And he had actually read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in the original German. And then in 1933, he was given a copy of an American version, an English version of Mein Kampf. And this is a copy of the flyleaf that Roosevelt had for that book. And he wrote on the inside cover of Mein Kampf. So here's Franklin Roosevelt, the White House, 1933. For those of you that can't read Roosevelt handwriting, President Roosevelt writes in his English version of Mein Kampf, 1933, this translation is so expurgated as to give a wholly false view of what Hitler really is and says. The German original would tell a different story. And so the Americanized or the English version of Mein Kampf had taken out a lot of the anti-Semitism and a lot of the hate that Hitler was spewing, because Hitler wanted to gain support in and among people in America. And in fact, people like Henry Ford, people like Lucky Lindy, right? These were folks who said, well, they've done a good job of getting their industry back together over there. Yeah, but at what cost? At what price? And by 1939, Adolf Hitler had solidified his power, consolidated his power, and was getting ready to launch his world domination campaign. And he did that on September 1st, 1939, when he invaded Poland. And FDR in 1939 was in his 8th year of the presidency, and he was getting ready to retire the presidency, as every president had done up to that time. George Washington had served for 2 terms and said, well, it's time to get some new blood. We don't want another King George here. And so every president had followed that 2-term tradition. But by 1939, as Franklin Roosevelt had seen what Hitler was capable of and seen what Hitler was up to, and had read the original German version of Mein Kampf, and knew what was in Hitler's heart in terms of the hate, if Hitler even had a heart. And so he decided in 1939 that he should run for a 3rd term. And he did this in part to protect his legacy of the New Deal programs, but also because he didn't think it would be a good time to be breaking in a new president. Just as Hitler had solidified his power and was getting ready for world domination, Roosevelt thought, this guy's going to cause trouble. We need to have somebody over here that can, keep an eye on this. And by 1939, Roosevelt had 7 years of government administrative experience. Right, he'd been president for 7 years. He knew how to get things done. He had allies in Congress that he could go to and ask for favors and, put the pressure on and get things through Congress. He had folks around the country who owed him favors, powerful people, rich people, people in the media, people in the newspapers that were able to he was able to use those folks to help get his message out, to help get his ideas across. He had the trust and the faith of the American people. Roosevelt had gotten us through the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression didn't end. It was still going on, but conditions had gotten much better. And unemployment had gone from as high as 25% down to 14%. And then once the war began, it dropped even more because we needed full production for the war effort. Roosevelt had relationships with world leaders like Winston Churchill. And this would be very, very important when it came time to build the allowance. And he also had the experience and knowledge of how government and politics and media works. And this is something that Hitler had, right? You know, Hitler was a master at manipulating his people. He was a master at manipulating the media. He was a master at manipulating the politics in his country, all done in incredibly devious and evil ways, but nonetheless very effective, to the point where he was now in a position to threaten the rest of the world. Franklin Roosevelt had also been a stamp collector. From the time he was a little boy, and when he's 8 years old, his mother gave him his first set of stamps, and he became a stamp collector, and this stayed with him for the rest of his life. At the time of his death, he had over 1 million stamps in his stamp collection. Now you might think, well, what does that have to do with World War II? Well, World War II was a global war. And so Roosevelt knew a lot of places in the world from having collected stamps from those places. So when a battle was being fought in some far off little corner of Asia, or some far off little corner of Europe, or some tiny little island in the Pacific, Roosevelt knew where these places were. He knew about the people that were there. He knew about the history that had been there. And more importantly, he knew the locations. So he had a great view of the entire planet, really. And, when you're fighting a world war on that level, that's something that's really important to have. And then finally, Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. And this is very important because he was the #2 man in the Navy. A guy by the name of Joseph Daniels was the #1 guy in the Navy, but he didn't really like the day-to-day operations of it. So he let Roosevelt handle a lot of that. And what Joseph Daniels did was he hung out a lot in Washington and, kind of did the congressional thing and all that sort of stuff, while Roosevelt was really working on the day-to-day operations of the Navy. And what this did was it gave Roosevelt a sense of how to get men, material, ships, planes, support, supplies across an ocean during a war that you could then fight on a different continent. And this was a great set of skills to have, given the fact that he was now commander-in-chief, and we were fighting a war. We were going to be fighting a war in Europe again, and we were going to be fighting a war on the Pacific Rim as well. So these were all skills that I think made him a great commander-in-chief. This knowledge of geography, this knowledge of how government worked, this having kind of an insight into what Hitler was really all about, so that the wool wasn't being pulled over his eyes like it was, Lindbergh and Ford and those kinds of folks. He had this experience of gearing a nation up for a world war, as he did during the First World War. So all of these things came together in the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt. And I want to show you a picture. Here he is with the big three. This is, he is one of the big three. This is what they called the big three. So you had Roosevelt, you had Winston Churchill, and you had Joseph Stalin. And these were the big allies that were fighting against the Axis powers of Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito. And Roosevelt was the undisputed leader of the big three. Okay, he was the one that kept these other guys headed in the right direction, kept these other guys in line as much as was possible, and he was the leader of that coalition. So let's take a look at Roosevelt's strategy and his wartime goals. His first wartime goal was to stay out of it. Right? He did not want to get into this war. He saw what was going on over there in Europe. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, World War I. He had given a speech, a famous speech, where he says, "I hate war." And he wasn't a desk jockey. He didn't sit home during the war as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He went to the battle sites. He went to the ports. He went to the places where the fighting was going on, so that he could get a sense of what was going on and what the folks needed firsthand during that First World War. So goal number one, stay out of it. Then that switched, after we got into the war, to goal number two, which was win decisively. Roosevelt understood that part of the problem and the reason that we got into a Second World War was because the First World War had ended so messy. All right, it had ended with the Germans kind of just giving up, not really feeling defeated. Everybody was just tired of this war going on. And so it was kind of like when you're playing Scrabble, and there's no place left to go, and you're just tired, and it's just a matter of time before you lose anyway. And you just say, oh, let's just call the game, right? And then the other person says, okay, we'll call the game. And then you turn around and say, well, I didn't really lose though, did I, right? Because we called the game. That's exactly what Hitler did and the Germans did after the First World War. They felt that they had been cheated out of a victory. And then when the victory did occur, when they gave up and the Allies during the First World War won, what the Allies during the First World War won, particularly Great Britain and France, did was they kind of rubbed Germany's nose in it. Like, okay, you guys lost, we won, even though you kind of gave up, but we won, and so now we want territory from you. We want you to pay back war reparations. We're not going to let you rearm yourself. And they basically were sore. We were basically sore losers, the Allies during the First World War, and Adolf Hitler was able to take advantage of that. So Roosevelt wanted to win decisively. There will be none of this kind of walking off the field kind of thing. We will destroy the enemy. We will take apart their mechanism to make war, and there will be no absolutely no question that we have won. And then the third goal that Roosevelt had for the war, number one, stay out of it. Number two, win decisively. And number three was to create a mechanism to prevent a third world war. Because Roosevelt believed, we can't be doing this. We can't be having wars every 20 to 25 years, world wars, where an entire generation goes off to war and is destroyed. 11 million people in the First World War, 60 million people in the Second World War, hundreds of millions in the Third World War. We simply cannot do this. So those are his war goals. And how did he go about doing that? Well, we're going to take a look right now. He does sort of a long arc of the way he wants to, provide this leadership during the war. And it's an arc that includes speeches. It's an arc that includes actions. It's an arc that includes agreements as well. And we'll take a look at those here. Now, here's the problem that Roosevelt faces in the late 1930s. Hitler is risen to power. He is a troublemaker, right, to say the least, and he's dominating all of Europe. He wants to take over the world. He says he wants to take over the world. It's not even like we're just, implying that. That's what he says. He is taking it upon himself to rid Eastern Europe of the Jewish population. And the problem that Roosevelt had was that a lot of Americans weren't paying attention. A lot of folks were still tired and hungry and worried from the Great Depression. What's going on in Europe? Oh, they're fighting again? Well, what else is new, right? We're not getting dragged into that again. I have to worry about putting food on my table. I have to worry about if my job's going to go away. I don't want to go through, that whole thing again. And so Roosevelt has this nation that is very interested in staying out of the war, as he is as well. But because he has Hitler's number, he knows that sooner or later we're going to have to, face the music with Hitler. So in October of 1937, Franklin Roosevelt gives a speech in Chicago that he calls, that comes to be called the quarantine speech. And he says, when you have these nations that are aggressors, it's like a cancer. And what we need to do is we need to surround that cancer and crush it. We need to surround it and keep it from spreading. So he gives this quarantine speech. Now, keep in mind, we weren't prepared to really do anything at this point, at least in terms of military power. We had let our military dwindle during this time. So he's calling for these things without any kind of real ability to back them up. So rather than take these guys on face on, full on, what we need to do is quarantine these guys. In November of 1938, 11 months later, he calls for the production of 10,000 combat aircraft to be created in this country each year. So what Roosevelt is doing is he's walking this very fine line between beginning to prepare the country for war, but at the same time staying out of it. And in 1939, in September, when Germany invades Poland, Roosevelt goes on and he gives a fireside chat and he declares the United States officially neutral. And that was because those what the laws were saying, from the post World War I period. But he said just because we're officially neutral doesn't mean Americans have to be neutral in their hearts, because obviously he saw that Hitler was not being it was being the tyrant that he was and taking over the rest of the world. I want to show you a political cartoon that is the result of what happens here. By May of 1940, FDR calls for an increase from 10,000 aircraft a year to 50,000 combat aircraft per year. And he's starting to take some heat. And here's a political cartoon that shows that. So it's a picture of President Roosevelt, and it says war hysteria, and he's beating the drum for war. Right. And a lot of people are saying, well, wait a minute, we don't want to go to war. What are you talking about? And he wasn't trying to get us into the war. He certainly wasn't trying to do that. But what he was trying to do was to prepare us in case we did get in the war, in case we did. So it's kind of like, when you stock up on, batteries and water and food and all that sort of stuff, because you hear there's a storm coming, right? You hope you're not going to need that stuff. You hope you're not going to have to use that stuff, but you might. And so you better have it. It'd be better to have it than not have it in that case. In September of 1940, he starts the very first ever peacetime draft here in the United States. And, he begins to call up young men to be trained. When these young men arrive at the training sites, many of them are handed brooms or 2x4s to practice with, because, there were no rifles yet. They didn't have enough rifles for everybody. They were trained with trucks that had the word tank painted on the outside of them, because we didn't have enough tanks to train everybody that way. And then in December of 1940, just 3 months later, because Hitler is just pouring all over Europe, Roosevelt declares the United States to be the arsenal of democracy, that countries that are fighting against the Nazis can come to us for material and weapons and those sorts of things. And eventually, within 2 years, the United States is providing 80% of the weapons needed to fight the Axis powers during the Second World War. It's often said that England had the tenacity, right? Think about it, right? They're sitting there off the coast of Europe. All of Europe is Nazis now, and they're not taking any of it, right? They're getting bombed, they're getting blitzed, they're worried about it, but they're fighting on, and they're, doing what they can to hang on. So they have the tenacity. It's often said the Soviet Union had the manpower. Of that 60 million people who were killed during the war, ladies and gentlemen, 20 million of them, 1/3, were Soviets. Right? 1/3 of them were Soviets. It's part of the reason why the Soviet Union was so paranoid toward the end of the war. They had lost more than anybody else had in that. But it's also said that the United States provide the manufacturing. We had the factories, we had the material, the raw materials, in order to provide all the equipment that was needed to fight that war. Now, in January of 1941, Franklin Roosevelt gives a speech before Congress. It's actually a State of the Union address, but it comes to be called the Four Freedoms speech. And I have a copy of it here. And on page 18 of the Four Freedoms address, Roosevelt lays out 4 things you would fight for. Now, he says, I don't want to go to war. Nobody wants to go to war, right? Everybody wants to be, out of this war. But if you did go to war, there's 4 fundamental freedoms that you would fight for. And these are freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of expression and speech, and freedom of religion. These are the 4 pillars upon which humanity should be created and should survive. And Norman Rockwell then paints the famous Four Freedoms portraits based upon Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. And what Franklin Roosevelt is doing in this Four Freedoms speech, ladies and gentlemen, is he is giving the world a new narrative, a narrative of hope, a narrative of possibility. Hitler is giving a narrative of death and destruction and murder. Roosevelt is giving a narrative of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of speech and expression, freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of religion. He is giving the world hope for freedom, while Hitler is giving the world nothing to look forward to but death and destruction. This becomes the rallying cry for all nations who are fighting against the Nazis. Now, in August of 1941, he meets secretly with Winston Churchill, and they draft what's called the Atlantic Charter. And what this does is it signs up the United States and the English to fight against Hitler, and to fight against Hitler to prevent him from taking over the world, and to stop him from taking over the rest of Europe, and to keep the freedoms of the seas, to keep freedom of trade, and to fight Hitler back to his borders. Not for territorial gain, not for being able to have the victories of spoil, the spoils of victory, but to get Hitler back into his box. That's what the Atlantic Charter was all about. And this is really important because, again, what Roosevelt's trying to do is prevent the problem that happened at the end of the Second World War. Well, everything changes on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, and suddenly we are in the war. And it's purported that Roosevelt said, we're in the wrong war, because he understood what Hitler was about, and he really thought that Hitler was the biggest challenge to peace in the world. And so he gives this Day of Infamy speech, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. And he lays out what the Japanese have done. They've attacked the United States. They've destroyed Pearl Harbor, much of the Pacific Fleet, and we will win on to absolute victory. This is what Roosevelt says. Now, keep in mind, he's saying this when we are anywhere from 14th to 17th in military strength in the world, when the Nazis have 6.5 million men in uniform, and we have less than 500,000. So we have some catching up to do. We have some making up to do. Now, in January, a month later, he holds a conference in Washington, D.C., and this is a conference of nations who are going to be united against the Nazis. And I have a copy of what that roster looked like. So here is this list. And this is a list of countries that are united against the Nazis. And so Roosevelt begins to call these nations that are united against the Nazis the United Nations. And this is where this concept first begins to come. Now, what's interesting about this is, I don't know if you can read it again, his handwriting, but it says the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And then below that, it's got Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India. So these are the British colonies that are still existing. And it had been, 150 years earlier, the United States would have been under there, right? America. But these were the British colonies. And when Roosevelt sees this listed out this way, he takes his pencil and he puts these countries where they ought to be in order of importance, not in order of importance, but in alphabetical order. And so what Roosevelt is basically saying is these United Nations are going to fight this war not to maintain the British Empire, but to have all nations stand where they are on their own as peaceful nations in the world. Now, when Churchill sees this, he almost poops a scone, right? Because he's like, wait a minute, what? You're not going to help to fight to provide the, to preserve the British Empire? And Roosevelt's, no, we're not. I'm not sending American men, American blood, American women to fight for the British Empire. I'll send them to fight to defeat the Nazis, and so that each country can stand on its own from there on out. There were a series of wartime conferences. The first was in January 1943, and that was at Casablanca. And Roosevelt and Churchill meet there, and they decide on this policy of unconditional surrender. Now, this becomes a little bit controversial later in the war, because when you have a policy of unconditional surrender, what that means is your enemy is likely to fight harder, right? If I'm fighting with you and I know that, I can say, okay, I'll stop fighting, but under these conditions, and we can negotiate that, then I'm more likely to give up, right? And stop fighting. But if you and I are fighting and you tell me, look, Jeff, you know what? I'm going to defeat you no matter what, and there's going to be no ifs, ands, or buts about it, then I know that I have to keep fighting to the death. And that was some of the criticism that Roosevelt got for this, that this policy of unconditional surrender made the enemy fight harder because they knew that there was only two ways out: total victory or total defeat. But that's what Roosevelt wanted, because he remembered back to the First World War when there was not total victory or total defeat, and that laid the seeds for the Second World War. He did not want to lay the seeds for the Third World War. Also at this conference at Casablanca, it was determined, and it was self-evident that Hitler could not be trusted to negotiate. He had systematically broken treaty after treaty after treaty, and he could not be trusted. So even if he sat down at the negotiating table and said, okay, I quit, it's over, I'll be good from now on, they knew they couldn't trust that. So that was what was decided at Casablanca: unconditional surrender, no negotiating with Nazis. Then in November of 43, at a meeting in Cairo, they decided to build up China to be one of the other big nations in the world, along with the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. And these four nations were going to be what FDR called the four policemen. These were going to be the big, large countries in the world that would keep the peace after the war. The four policemen: the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. Later on that month, also in November of 1943, they meet at Tehran, and it's at Tehran that they agree to open the second front against Hitler in Europe, which is, of course, the D-Day invasion. And FDR is beginning to cozy up to Stalin at this point, because Roosevelt's got this vision for a United Nations developing in his head, and he knows he's going to need the Soviet Union. Now, while they're at Tehran, Roosevelt is sketching. And this is his sketch for what he has now formulated in his mind of what the United Nations should look like. So this sketch, ladies and gentlemen, is the sketch for the structure of the United Nations in New York City. So he says there should be 40 United Nations, right? 40 main countries. There should be an executive committee, and then the four policemen. And these should be the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. He says the purpose of these United Nations is going to be to create an ILO, which is an international labor organization, a health organization, and a food and agriculture committee and organization. So what he wants the United Nations to do for the world is to provide peace through the four policemen, jobs through the International Labor Organization, health for people through a World Health Organization, and food through a World Food Organization. And here he is, November 30th, 1943, Franklin Roosevelt, Tehran. So Roosevelt has this vision for the United Nations, a mechanism that will be in place after the war to settle disputes between countries with the four policemen, and to provide for people basically the four freedoms, right? Freedom from want, freedom from fear. Am I worried? Is there going to be another pandemic? Is there going to be disease in my country? Don't worry about it. The World Health Organization will help to solve that. What about food? The World Food Organization will help to create food for folks. What about a job? Don't worry. We're going to try to get these resources to be used effectively for people, so that everyone has jobs, everyone has access to these resources. Now, at Yalta, Roosevelt has to get Stalin to sort of sign on to this whole idea. And so he says, okay, Stalin, I want you to work with me on this. And Stalin says, okay. Now, in Stalin's mind, Stalin sees Roosevelt as kind of setting up this thing where they're going to run the world, these two countries. But Roosevelt doesn't see that. He wants the United Nations to do it, and he wants the Soviet Union to be 1/4 of the policeman of the world. Stalin is misreading him here. And this is where the criticism comes that Roosevelt gave away Eastern Europe to Stalin, because Stalin walked away thinking, oh, great, I can stay right where I am in Europe. I don't have to give Poland back. It's going to be great. I'm going to have this whole, section and chunk of the world I can be in charge of. That's not what Roosevelt wanted. And in fact, in April of 1945, Roosevelt was going to walk Stalin back from that a little bit. There was going to be a United Nations conference, the first United Nations conference in San Francisco at the end of April. The problem was Franklin Roosevelt died in the middle of April. He died on April 12th, and he never got to go to that conference, and he was never able to work on walking back Stalin's idea of what this United Nation was supposed to be about. So peace for after the war, he wanted this United Nations. He wanted the United Nations to provide food. He wanted the United Nations to provide safety for the rest of the world. And he understood that if we didn't have something like this, that the prospect of a third world war would be very big and very great. And the costs of that would be phenomenal, right? Hundreds of millions of people killed. Eleanor Roosevelt gets appointed to the United Nations. She goes there. She works very hard to create a universal Declaration of Human Rights, carrying on President Roosevelt's vision for the United Nations. And, I don't have to tell you that the Allied strategy created through Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joe Stalin worked. We were able to defeat Hitler. We were able to defeat Mussolini. We were able to defeat Hirohito, and we were able to bring a decisive and conclusive end to the Second World War. We were able to create a world body that has now, for over 80 years, prevented a Third World War. So I would argue that Roosevelt's leadership during the World War, the Second World War, because of this great skill set that he had, was one that had a vision for ending the war decisively and then creating a stable environment for peace that we've managed to maintain for 80 years. Now, has there been conflict in the world? Absolutely. Many conflicts. Has there been a Third World War? No. And I'll leave it at that, and we'll open it up to some questions and answers. Any questions, comments, snide remarks?
I'm pulling that up right now. So guys, go ahead, and if you have any questions, please put those into the chat for us. I do have one question from Kathy Aiello. She was wondering if they sell copies of the periodic table to the public.
We do not sell copies of the periodic table to the public. However, I'll give you one.
Hey, Kathy, how's that sound?
Oh, wow.
She's muted right now. I'm gonna unmute her. I'm gonna ask everybody to unmute real quick.
That's
okay?
phenomenal.
Great.
All right.
Send me your mailing address. Dan's got that. Just send me that through an email, and I will be happy to send you not only the World War II periodic table,
Wow,
and where the atomic number is on the front, you flip it over on the back. It's got more information about the war. But wait, there's more. Order now. You'll also get the periodic table of the New Deal. That's right.
Oh, wow.
44 programs of the New Deal created by Franklin Roosevelt over the course of the Great Depression. And again, where the atomic number is here, there's more information on the back as well.
Oh my gosh. That is phenomenal.
Well, you're welcome. Shoot me an email with your mailing address and I'll get those in the mail to you.
So I'll have to, Dan, do you have his email?
yes. I mean, can I give that to them, Jeff, or do you want me to? Okay, great. I will make sure that I will get the email out. I'll put it in the chat in just one second.
Okay.
Real quick, guys, before we go any further, Jeff, everybody give a big round of applause to Jeff because this was fantastic, first of all.
Hey,
Incredible.
Hold on you.
This was great. Richard Rogers asked the question, so Stalin did not break with the group until after FDR's death.
Well, Stalin was beginning to creak and beginning to pull away. Now here, and this is very interesting. So thank you for asking that question. And it's going to take me a couple of minutes to explain this. And I know we're a little over time, but I'm willing to stick around for a while. So let's not, if that's okay with everybody else. Here's what goes on with Stalin. So the communists and the capitalists were never exactly great friends to begin with. But we had a common enemy, and the common enemy was Hitler. And Hitler wanted to dominate the world, which would have been Nazism, fascism. And neither the capitalists, us in the West, or the communists, the Soviet Union, wanted that to happen. So the alliance to begin with was kind of an arranged marriage. The enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of a thing. So that was number one. Number two was that the Soviets lost 20 million people during the war. And the way that D-Day occurred, the United States, being all, cowboys that we are, we want to just rush right in and attack Europe and, drive on to, to Berlin. The British, who had been fighting the Nazis for 3 or 4 years before we did, thought that was a stupid idea. And they said, you guys are going to get your butts handed to you. These Nazis know how to fight, and they have the equipment to do it. What you need to do is you need to nibble around the edges. You can't just go straight on in. You're going to get your head handed to you. And this was a debate that was going back and forth between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, because his generals were like, let's go, let's go. In fact, Roosevelt gave a memo to his generals, and he said, Franklin, and he signed it, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief. He reminded them, I'm the guy that makes the decisions around here, right? You guys are the generals, I'm the Commander-in-Chief. So Stalin saw this argument going back and forth as a stall. And he thought that the Allies, the United States and Great Britain, were stalling while Hitler was moving into the Soviet Union, right? He'd attacked the Soviet Union. And Stalin said, you guys are stalling so that Hitler wears me down. Basically, you're not opening a second front because you want Hitler to beat me up. You want Hitler to destroy me, and you're letting him do the job for you. That's really not what was happening. What was happening was this big debate between how to go about doing this. So Stalin's lost 20 million people. Stalin and the United, the capitalists are not exactly buddies to begin with. This strategy is going on as to how to open a second front and take some pressure off the Soviet Union. But in Stalin's view, it's taken way too long. Then here's another thing. This is a rare document. It's called the tube alloy document. And I don't know if you ever heard of the tube alloy document. It was a secret document. Tube alloys was the code name for the atomic bomb. Right? We know it as the Manhattan Project, but the actual bomb was a tube alloy. That was the code name. So there was a meeting here in Hyde Park with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, and they talked about, okay, what are we going to do about this atomic bomb? Right, we're working on this thing. What are we going to do about it? And I'll read it to you, and then I'll hold it up. So it says there was a 3-part memo. This is Hyde Park, between the president and the prime minister, Hyde Park, New York, September 18th, 1944. So there's basically 3 memos, 3 parts of this. The first part says that the United States and Great Britain will work together to create an atomic bomb. The second part says that once they find it, or once they discover it and make it workable, they will use it together to defeat Germany Germany and Japan. And then the third thing is, it says inquiries should be made regarding the activities of Professor Bohr, and I'll show you this in a second, and steps taken to ensure he is responsible for no leakage of information, particularly to the Russians. Okay, now here's the deal. You got 3 allies, the big 3. 2 of them are working on an atomic bomb. They're not telling the other guy. We're not telling Stalin we're working on an atomic bomb. but Stalin knows we're working on an atomic bomb because he's got spies in the program. So we're building this atomic bomb. We're not telling him about it, but he knows we're doing it. And this feeds into his paranoia that these guys can't be trusted. You know, these guys are conspiring. They're supposed to be my buddies. They're supposed to be allies. They're conspiring against me. They can't be trusted. So Stalin is really beginning to think, you know, gee, I don't know if this is going to, how this is going to work or what's this going to do here. And so what ends up happening is that's where, FDR really has to try to bring Stalin in on this. And he knows there can be no United Nations without the participation of the Soviet Union. So he says to Stalin, look, you know, come on, you got to work with us on this. You got to make this happen. And the Soviets had already moved into most of Eastern Europe because remember, they were fighting from the Soviet Union toward Berlin from that side. We were fighting from the Atlantic Ocean toward Berlin from that side. So once we got there and we ultimately ended up defeating Germany, there was, you know, how were we going to get the Soviet Union out of the territory that he'd taken over? The only way we could do that was through negotiation. And that's what Roosevelt was planning to do at the conference in the end of April in San Francisco, to say, look, you know, hey, the war's over, right? You know, remember the Atlantic Charter? You know, the whole thing was we're not fighting for territorial gain. We're fighting to contain Nazis, get rid of the Nazis, you know, to end the Nazis and, you know, not, you know, get over on each other. And Stalin wasn't necessarily buying into that. Once Roosevelt died, then Stalin could come in with Truman, who had no idea what was going on because he'd only been vice president for 83 days. And Stalin was like, well, you know, there's a new sheriff in town. You know, there's a whole new thing here. And he also didn't trust the United States and England because of that tube alloy memo. Let's see here. Anybody else?
Any other questions, guys? Anything else you want to ask Jeff? Vivian, to answer your question, yes, this will be up on YouTube. We'll try to have this up before we go to Thanksgiving break. We will try and have that up there before then, so sometime next week, I hope.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Guys, any other questions for Jeff?
No, Jeff, I just sent you an email
Hello.
to get my periodic table.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks. I'll get it out to you next week.
Okay, I'll make
Okay,
sure.
thank
Hold
you
on.
very much, Jeff.
You're welcome.
And,
You're welcome.
Bye.
Okay,
Anybody
somebody was on the
else?
phone.
Yeah,
All right.
Jeff, what's on your tie?
Oh, my tie is actually a military tie. So
Oh,
here's Iwo Jima. Here is some of the battle insignia. Here is President Roosevelt and the Day of Infamy. Here's a top secret document. Oh, you can't
where
read
did
that
where
part.
did you get that?
I got this in our gift shop,
That's
which is not currently open. And it's funny you should say that. With the holidays right around the corner,
Right. Oh.
That was a fantastic tie-in. I love it.
yeah,
Oh,
I
a
get it.
tie-in.
Tie-in.
Listen to a tie-in.
See, and
Kathleen Kirby says she wishes you were her history professor. That's
Aw.
Me
awesome.
too.
You are our
me
history
too, I
professor, Jeff.
second that.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, you've been fantastic, Jeff. Let me put myself on real fast. This,
Well,
go ahead.
Let's not forget, it was the men and women on the ground that were fighting those battles. It was the men and women back here at home that were, you know, manning the machines and, you know, supplying the material and all that. But Roosevelt created that, you know, that leadership. He had the foresight to walk that fine line between preparing and staying out, so that once we got in, we were actually ready to go to business.
Let's see, and then Christine Taylor says, I never realized the leaders actually met in person during the war that often.
Yeah, they especially Churchill and FDR. They had about, in our collection, we actually have over 2,000 correspondences back and forth between Roosevelt and Churchill through cables, you know, diplomatic cables and such. So they were talking to each other all the time. You know, so you think about, you know, what would be, I didn't do the math, but if you broke out 2,000 over, you know, September 1st, 1939 to, you know, April 45, I don't know how many times a month they were talking, but they were talking a lot.
Kathy Aiello asked, how do you look up the gift shop? That's amazing.
If you go to, it's actually not open currently because of the COVID situation. Our
But I
COVID
want one of
situ-
those ties. I
Well,
live in Dallas.
You're going to have to wait. You're just going to have to wait. Once we're up and running again, we're not, actually, I'm only on site like 1 day a week for 6 hours
Oh.
because of the way COVID works. So we don't, our gift shop is not open, and, you know, we don't have any ability to get in there to sell you
Oh.
stuff. We'd love to, and we will as soon as we're up and running again. So you just keep an eye on when we get open, and we'll be happy to, you know, send you this stuff.
Now, let me ask you a
Okay.
question, Jeff. I have a question for you real fast. So you're doing
Yeah.
this from home then right now?
Correct.
Okay, I was wondering where in the library you were, you know, because you always have the same, your backdrop, you know, with this a fantastic backdrop. Where are you? And I'm wondering where you, okay, so this is home. Okay.
This is my dining room.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Wow.
Hey, when COVID first started and we started doing this and my kids playing tuba in one place and my wife's working in the other, where was I working out of, guys? Remember I was sitting in my closet with the background
Yeah.
so y'all couldn't see where I was, all my clothes. So I get it. I get it completely. Well, this is fantastic, guys.
We got to make it happen no matter what. We're not going to let the information not get out there. And you guys are wonderful and so sweet to have me back so many times. And
Can't wait for the next one.
I'll be happy to come back as many times as you're happy to have me.
Always enjoy your talks, Jeff.
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent information.
Wonderful, Jeff. Thank you.
We
Wonderful.
love having you
Okay.
here, Jeff.
Go find a veteran and thank them.
Absolutely.
Veteran.
On that note, let's say that, yeah, we'll wrap up there. Everybody have a wonderful Veterans Day. Go thank a veteran, like
Bye.
Jeff said, and we'll see you next week, okay?
Yes.
Have a
Yes.
wonderful,
Take care.
wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Jeff, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Round of
Bye,
applause.
everyone.